Everyone has a preference for how they like information to be presented to them, so they can process it with relative ease. We also have preferences for the way we analyse, evaluate the information and then communicate it back out to other people. Identifying your personal learning style is a major key to improving your performance, and particularly that of your students as well. When we become more familiar with learning styles, we can help our students learn faster and more efficiently and effectively. In this broadcast, I will help you to identify your preferred modality and also provide some insight into how others learn and communicate. I'll provide you as well with an introduction to basic NLP principles, and that will help you identify teaching strategies and methods to help your students learn at their best. Welcome to Learning Styles and Neuro Linguistic Programming Distinctions. I'm Karen Bonanno and I'll be your host and presenter for this broadcast. I've been personally involved in the education sector since the late 70s in various roles. In 1994, I established an independent education consultancy service for schools, which now includes this virtual professional learning platform, EduWebinar, and we've been providing professional learning for teachers since 2011. As an accredited consultant in talent dynamics for young people and ignition, I also focus on the personal and skills development for tweens, teens and young adults, and also grown-ups, the big kids. I'll be sharing with you some of those tools as part of this focus on learning styles and NLP. Before I begin, I'll cover some basic housekeeping. Please note that this information that I'm sharing with you is as a result of my own training and development and also research into these particular aspects, and I'm sharing them with you to provide you with a starting point of how you might adopt some of the tools and then apply them to your workplace. A restriction on the broadcast is that EduWebinar does not give permission for any capture, recording or reproduction of this webinar in any format unless you do have prior permission from us to do so. Just by way of introduction, what I want to do first of all is define NLP if you're not familiar with that terminology. I'll also introduce you to the concept of what is called representational systems. Now that's NLP language, but what it means is how we perceive the world, like our looking at it externally, and then how we inwardly take that information and then represent it, our experiences to others. Now I'll go into more of that in a moment, but also I'm going to look at the psychometric tools that we use and then look at characteristics of the different learning styles and how you can pick up certain attributes that people have. I want to focus a lot on the how to learn best aspect, looking at certain distinctions, looking at the language that people will use, and then finally in that section looking at the learning styles, and learning strategies and methods, and then finishing off with a focus on blended learning within the modern educational environment. So let's start first of all unpacking what Neuro Linguistic Programming is all about. The first component is neuro is equal to mind, and so it is about how we organise our mental life, our thinking. It's a bit like a big computer processor. As we put the information in, we process that within our mind to then be able to work out the sort of analysis and synthesis and the sifting and the sorting before we then represent it out, and that's where the language comes in. So the language is how we will use this information and how it may affect others, because the way we might interpret information may be quite different to how someone will then put that information out. The next term is programming. And so what this is behaviour. And what it is all about is it's the sequences of repetitive behaviour and how we act things out. So really NLP is about connecting our thoughts, our speech and our actions. Now if we think about this with kids, they can engage in this in a positive or a negative way. And the outcomes as a result of this combination of their thoughts, their speech and their actions. So we'd look at it in a learning context, but we look at it in everyday life as well. So that's what NLP is about. When it comes to representational systems, what we've got here is our multi-senses coming into play. And so it's the way that we take in and store and code that information in our minds, how we see it, hear it, feel it, taste it and smell it. And these are all known as representational systems. So if you look at our little diagram on the side here, this is our kinesthetic touch, okay? Then we've got our auditory, we've got our visual with our eyes, then we have our nose for smelling and ears for hearing. So we've got all of these bits and pieces here that, this one's the taste. What happens is when we are using all our multi-senses, we will take that external information in and then we run it through our own internal filters. Now these filters can be things like our beliefs, our values, our experience. There's a whole host of things that will filter, and that's a personal filter that we bring. It may be influenced by things that are said to us as a child. It may be later on in life, but whatever it is, we will filter that information in and then store it somehow so that we can draw on it, recall it, draw it back. So if we think about, let's say, kinesthetic, which is touch or feeling, we have this external sort of tactile sensation like touch or even temperature, and then we internalize it by possibly remembering sensations or emotions or inner feelings, and that's our kind of filters. And then when we represent it again externally, it may be in a totally different way to what we actually received it. But all of this is happening in a very complex way. If we do, say, auditory, it's hearing something, but the internal process might be for someone who is very predominant in auditory, they might kind of have some self-talk, or they might need to kind of mouth the words or some way that they're kind of internalizing what they've just heard. If you think about something like a toddler when they're young and they're told, you know, hot plate, don't touch, you know, hot Bernie, whatever it might be that we say, that is like a kinesthetic external, but they, through a filter over time, they will learn that to touch something like that, it's hot and it will harm them. So this is all, as I said, a very complex process of what our mind is doing in this, our mind, our neuro component, the language, and then the programming, how we then represent that back. Now when it comes to learning styles, these are also all part and parcel. The olfactory and gustatory tend to go in with the kinesthetic, and often you'll hear learning styles referred to as VACA. Pardon me. So the A is the analytic, and I'll get to that in a moment. But just to talk about the psychometric tools, some of you may have experienced using Myers-Briggs in a way that you may have used it as a profiling tool for staff, or it might be building a team within the school, or you may have family members who have talked about that. This is like the Myers-Briggs, and it comes from the same background with the Carl Jung psychometrics. But the two tools that I've been using, this one on the left here called Ignition, has been designed for tweens and teens, but it's the same process. There is the evidence of the 4 frequencies, or the 4 learning styles, so Nova, exuberant, sensational and wise, and then a further breakdown of that is going into actual profiles. With the adult, the young adult and the adults, it's the same. There we've got the dynamo, the blaze, the tempo and the steel. So this is representing our 4 learning styles and then the profiles. But all I'm going to focus on are the 4 learning styles within these 4 frequencies, and I'm going to use the tweens and teens one, even though it can be used with adults as well. But I thought last week, if you were on the webinar, I was using the adult combinations. I'm going to now use the younger version as well. If you want to find out more about either of these, you've got a web link there that you can go to see what they're about in a little bit more detail. But this is looking at the particular learning styles in a broader, I guess, categorization of VACA, the model of visual, auditory, kinesthetic and analytic. Now what we've got here is, you'll see here in this particular graph, and this is a representation of a actual student's results. And we can see here that for this particular student, they have each of the learning styles evident, but they are predominantly a visual learner. And they will use that in most cases, but will supplement it with the auditory and then the analytic and to a certain extent, the kinesthetic. But this is the combination. And in today's modern learning environment, we tend to see more a combination with one predominance rather than just someone being purely auditory or purely a kinesthetic learner. The other interesting thing that we find is that we have the introvert and the extrovert components. Now the introvert in this case is not introverted in that they're withdrawn. It's more a case of the analytical learner will appreciate more the opportunity to withdraw to a certain extent but have their space within which they will process the information before they will represent it in some form of communication. Even to a certain extent, some visual learners will tend to lean that way to introversion, or even the kinesthetic sensational learner will do the same. Then on the contra side, we have the extrovert. So the auditory person most definitely is someone who is vocal and who speaks out. And the same again, there are some visual learners who will be that way. There are some kinesthetic learners who really want to kind of show off or demonstrate what they're actually doing. And as I said, usually we have a bit of each of these, but we have one that's quite predominant. So let's have a look a little bit more at some of the characteristics, and we'll look at these in a little bit more detail. So our NOVA, or our visual learner, is idea smart. They're someone who is very creative. They will come up with bright ideas very rapidly. Their mind is, if you think about a grasshopper, it never sits still. It's jump, jump, jump. So they're quite innovative. They're very intuitive in their thinking. Their frontal lobe, which is the most creative part, they're very task-oriented. So they will just get in and get into the task, but they may not stay on task for any length of time because of the fact that their mind, their visual, is so active. If you think about it, they have like a movie running through their brain, and it is just constantly coming up with all different ideas. So you can see here with some of the other characteristics, they're very high energy, so they will move around a lot. They're big picture thinkers, so they will have a bigger view of how things are going to be rather than very narrow step by step. And for them, they gain their, I guess, self-worth by being significant. And if you look at some of the personnel under here who are role models for this particular NOVA visual profile, you've got Richard Branson, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Steven Spielberg, J.K. Rowling, those sort of people that are quite creative and are very visual and are kind of out there, very bold in what they do. So if there's a problem to be solved, those people will be coming up with all the great ideas and be very innovative in their particular practice. Then if we go to the exuberant, these people are very colourful characters, and hence the exuberance. They're the auditory learner. So they're very colourful. They have divergent thinking. So they always see that there's more than one way to do something when they're confronted with any particular problem. They're people smart because they want to connect with people. They have to talk through things because of the auditory. So they will hear, but then they will speak out. So that's the auditory component. They love to be able to connect with people, to have those discussions and debates and sit down and chat. And really, they are keen to have also some variety in what they do. If you see here, they're warm and passionate, they're friendly, they're fun, they're entertaining. Sometimes they can be a bit over the top, but for them, if they don't have variety in their life, or even, you know, colour, they will become very dull and maybe get bored. Now, if you look at the role models here, Beyonce, Oprah, Barack Obama, Ellen DeGeneres, these are all people who are quite vocal in addressing causes, or they're vocal in that they're a performer. They're also good orators. So these folk are really happy to get out there and speak up and say their piece. When we go to the next level, which is the sensational and the kinesthetic learner, these people, pardon me, if we think about where most of their activity happens, it happens in the temporal lobe, which is at the back of your skull, where all your feelings and a lot of your sensory perceptors for processing through your mind, they're very activity oriented. So they want to get in there and get their hands dirty and get quite active and involved, because their senses are mainly their touch, but they will bring in their other senses as well. The other aspect too is their feelings will come in here. So we've got the senses touch as in the external kinesthetic, the internal is how they feel about things. So they tend to be very down to earth, very balanced, grounded, calmer even, and they're caring, compassionate, they've got a great sense of timing. They're very reliable, so if you wanted something done, like you had a project, a kinesthetic person will be very reliable. For them, they have this strong sense of connection, of actually belonging, and hence they want to be more in that caring, compassionate, nurturing role with other people. So if they're working in a group, if you take a group of students, if they're working in a group, they will be that one who'll nurture everybody along and make sure that there's harmony and everyone's sort of, you know, happy little campers. So if you think about some of these people, Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Warren Buffett, who is more a person who uses the right time and place, where right time to invest, to buy and sell. Murdoch is in the news industry. He just seems to have this great sense of timing for what needs to happen with the changes in the whole news media environment. And then you've got Melinda Gates with the Foundation for looking at global disease. So these people are quite grounded in what they're doing. Then our last one that we'll look at now for the characteristics is the wise. The wise person is the analytic person, and they will tend to be a little bit different to their opposite, which is the exuberant. They're a little bit black and white. So there's kind of right, wrong, black and white, and they tend to be convergent thinkers, in that they believe that there's a right answer, and for them, they need to take the time to get to that right answer for them. Now, if we go back to the representational systems, they will take information, they'll filter it, they'll store it, and when they bring it back out, it's right for them. That's really what we're trying to say here. It may not be the right answer or the right response, but for them, they've taken their time to process that. So hence the detail smart, left brain, logical, step-by-step, procedural, all of those things. So they're data system oriented, and they tend to be cautious. They don't rush in, they take their time. Very structured, they like to get clarity. They will simplify a process. So anything that might be difficult, they're really smart at kind of simplifying that down. And for them, they gain their kind of sense of worth through the concept of certainty. Now, Mark Zuckerberg uses a system orientation to achieve what he wanted to achieve by setting up Facebook. Ray Kroc is the person behind the franchise of McDonald's. Frank Lowy is the Westfield Shopping Centre. So again, taking the whole concept of shopping, bringing it all together under one roof, so simplifying a process for people. Larry Page is with Google. Angela Merkel is a European leader. So all of these people exercise that WISE component. So who are you? Which one do you think you are? Now, while I take a chance to have a little bit of drink of water here, because I'm getting a bit of a tickle in my throat. It gives you a chance to think, well, who are you? Which one, from this, which one do you see as you are? Now, also here, if you're wanting to do the little Bright Spark test, then if you send me an email, I'll send you the link where you can do that. Or if you have a young person who you think it would be really great for them to know what their Bright Spark is, whether they're the visual, auditory, kinesthetic, or analytical, or even how their blend is, then please email me and I can send you that information. Now we'll move on to looking at some of the distinctions and also the language and the teaching learning strategies that you would use for these particular learning styles. So our NOVA visual person, they love this colour and gesture and movement, and they will learn best through pictures, videos, drawings, graphs, all those sorts of things. So for them, if we look at some of the distinctions, as a teacher, if you're predominantly a visual person, when you're imparting information or sharing information with them, you might actually say this sentence that is at the top. Do you see what I mean? And if you look at the word, the see, that's the clue that you may be more predominantly a visual person by saying that. If you have visual learners in your class, then they will connect with you. But if you don't, they will wonder what you're actually saying here. It may not have an immediate connection with them. But if we go through the distinctions, what we've got here with the visual learner is they are usually quite organised. They're neat and well groomed because it's important for them to look good. And also too, they expect you to look good as well. They will use visualization as a memory tool and a decision-making tool. So what will happen is if they're trying to make a decision, they will visualize that to be able to then recall it. And that's part of that internalization process through the filters to then say, well, how am I going to then use this to make a decision? They're also very imaginative. So a child in a classroom who would be a visual learner or strongly visual, they will often be considered to be a daydreamer and not paying attention, because for them, their mind is constantly moving rapidly through a whole lot of different visualizations. They're people who often stand tall and also have their head and their eyes erect. So you can actually see that these people are very visual. They want to take everything in. They also tend to speak faster than the general population, and this is because for them they have like pictures going through their mind moving very quickly. So what happens is they will speak quickly to make sure that they don't miss out on something that is going through their whole visual representation. They also like to be shown things, like shown concepts and ideas of how something is done, rather than being told. They're very good at remembering people's faces, but not their names. So they're not really good at anything that will rely on trying to use their other senses. Visual is predominantly what they need to do. So they'll also not remember what people have said because there's too much verbal information. But if you were to draw something, or give them a picture, then they would be able to see it and know what's going on. Now for them, they can get very distracted by the next bright shiny object. So think about what would be happening in a classroom if you can't keep that visual learner on task, because they're like the grasshopper. There's so many different things that are taking their attention. So think about that, of how you'd be able to manage those particular learners. Now if we look at the language that they adopt, some of these people you may have heard this, or you might kind of think, oh yes, I've heard someone say that. So they will say things like, when you're sharing with them, they will say, I see what you mean. Or they might say in the classroom, I can't see. And if they're up the back and people are standing around, they will actually want to see to be able to learn. So they should be encouraged to move forward into the classroom, so being more sitting up the front rather than sitting up the back. And then they will say things like, I'm trying to picture this. Or they might say, show me what you mean. And so this is how the language, we can pick up on the language of the learner to get some sense of where their particular modality predominantly may be. Then when we come into how the visual learner learns, here's a whole list of bits and pieces. And what I'd like you to do is maybe write down some of these if they're not familiar to you, because when I get to the end, I want to talk about how we need to blend the particular learning activities to give kids the option so that we can give them a higher chance of success, rather than for them to be struggling because they can't make that connection with you as the teacher. So think about some of these, and think about how you may even have used them, because all of these are important. Even when it comes to things like PowerPoint slides, whiteboards, or any sort of flip chart, that is a visual representation where you can put information down, and what you might put up there, it's it could be words, or it could be it's like a mind mapping process. Whatever it might be, it's still useful as a tool to have that visual sitting up there in front of the student. Even a handout is still a visual representation for them that they can look at and see, rather than for you to be telling them, this is what I want you to do. Because if you tell them, they will not be able to process that verbal instruction, as well as if they can see something to be able to undertake the task and to learn effectively within that space. Then if we go to our auditory learner, of course, learns best by being engaged in conversation. So they will want to talk, they'll also want to listen, they'll want to ask questions, they'll want to be involved in discussion, debate, conversations, all those sorts of things. So if we look at then some of the distinctions of the auditory learner, if you are a teacher who is predominantly auditory and you like giving out verbal instructions, then you may hear yourself say, do you hear what I'm saying? Particularly if you might get a blank look from a student. Now that student may not necessarily be an auditory learner, so you might get this blank look, and so you might be tempted to say, do you hear what I'm saying? And be aware that if they have a predominance that's not auditory, you need to think about how you're going to communicate with them. What these students may be, I guess, accused of in a classroom is that they talk too much. They're too much of a chatterbox. But for them, as you can see from these distinctions, they need to have the conversations with other people. When it comes to their eyes, they move a lot, because mainly they move kind of sideways because they're working, left, right, at their kind of ear level. When they're needing to, they will either talk to themselves, and you may actually think, this kid's getting a bit loony because they're having this little conversation with themselves. But they'll talk to themselves, but then they will also want to talk with others to be able to kind of deal with solving their problem or clarifying what they need to do, asking the right questions for that. They're easily distracted by noise because they're sensitive to the noise as well. You might even see that some of them might, when they're, maybe if they're reading, they'll move their lips, or they might even prefer to read out loud. They will often repeat things back to you because they're wanting to just clarify that this is what they need to do. They will pick up subtle changes in tone. So if you might raise your voice or you might use a different tone in your voice, they'll be the students who will pick that up, and then they will be attentive at that point because their auditory perceptors are going hammer for tongs, because that's how they take in the information. As I was indicated before with the role models, they're eloquent speakers. So they're quite confident in being able to speak because that's their natural way that they will kind of externally share the information or communicate it out. So think about what you would get them doing classroom activity-wise to engage them through that, because they prefer to communicate in a spoken language. With these kids, they need to be heard. So to a certain extent, that they may, depending, if you're not an auditory, you might find that that's a little bit overbearing, a little bit powerful, but that's the way that they operate. They're not being obnoxious. Well, you know, they probably could be obnoxious, but in general cases they're not. That's just their natural attributes, that they need to talk through the problems. They need to have somebody to serve as a sounding board for their ideas, and so that's what they will do, more so than just quietly going away and doing something which tends to be their opposite in the way that that works. If we think about the language that they use, then what we've got is they will respond back to you, and they will say things like, "I hear what you're saying," or "that sounds good." You might hear them say, "We speak the same language," "I like the story," "I'm lost for words." Other, I guess, metaphors, "it's music to my ears," and that rings a bell. So if you, even amongst your friends, if you hear them say that, then you can pick up relatively easily that they have a predominance towards auditory intake and also output of information. When we get into the exuberant learning strategies, this is what we'll tend to see. They will ask questions quite regularly, because by asking questions they're vocalizing what it is that they need to know. They will love getting involved in the whole discussion and conversation and debates and anything that's speaking. If you think about oral reports, definitely. Debating is another area that they'll be very strong in. Doing interviews, being either interviewee or interviewer. They like to be told how they're doing. That's their way of getting their immediate feedback. They need that spoken explanation. So if you were to give them a handout, so if we go back to the previous strategies of what you do for a visual learner, if you give them a handout, then you would need to support it by then speaking to that handout, even if it is to go through the key points or some summary aspects. If you're getting them to be involved in reading, then read aloud would be something that they're quite happy to do, because that's predominantly how they take in the information, but also how they give that out as well. So that's our auditory exuberant learner. If we go to our one that's at the bottom, the sensational, the kinesthetic, who's the balanced, takes in through their multi-senses, the touch, the feeling, being aware of temperature, being aware of moisture, all of these things that involve sort of some sensory aspect. They're the ones who like to get their hands on things. They need to get in and do, they need to be very activity-based for them to be able to learn more effectively. So if we think about this in certain way in the distinctions, if you're a kinesthetic predominant instructor, teacher, then you may hear yourself say, does it feel right to you? And again, being mindful that the other learning styles will not immediately connect in. So being aware that there might be other conversations that you would need to have to check in that the students have actually understood what it is that you've been sharing with them. So for these people, the kinesthetics, what they like to do is respond to physical rewards. So they would like to actually be able to touch it. So it might be something like a certificate, or it could be, you know, if they're in sporting, a little trophy or something like that. So that's what they, you know, that's what they love to get, is that opportunity to touch something, and that's important to them. They'll also stand close to people, and this is to feel that person's energy rather than, you know, to be kind of encroaching on someone's social space. But they want to be, that touch element's there. They want to be close to people to kind of get a feeling of what they're like. They'll also tend to speak slower than kind of the general population, because for them, they need time to get in touch with whether that is the right word to use at that time, or how they might feel about a topic. So they won't rush in a response, whereas your auditory learner may tend to be very quick to give an answer, whereas these guys will just take their time a little bit and then speak slowly, because they're checking to make sure that it's all right, it's feeling right to do that. They're not the snappy dresser like our visual person who wants to look good. The sensational person is more dressed for comfort. Now, they're not sloppy, it's just that's what they like. They just want to be functional, dress for comfort, and be that way rather than looking good. They'll make decisions based on their feelings, not in logic. If we go around to the analytical will make decisions based on logic. The sensational, the kinesthetic, will make their decisions based on feelings. But one good thing is that they're willing to give things a go, and that is to get their hands dirty, to get into it and give it a try and do trial and error. And that way then they will be able to engage in an activity and learn by giving it a go. You might see them wanting to engage in moving around and not sitting still. I know sometimes, even though I tend to be I'm a visual learner, I will sometimes draw on the kinesthetic when I'm trying to practice something. If I've got to get up in front of a face-to-face audience and present, I will walk around to get that creativity happening with whatever it is that I'm drawing on to get the right words out. The other thing is they can't sit still for too long, because they are this movement person. They want to get in there and get their hands on things, get active and get right involved in the whole process. When it comes to the language that you may hear them say, they will say, you know, I know how you feel. I'm ready to tackle this. I need something concrete. I need a hand. So they might put their hand up and ask that they need a hand. I can grasp the idea one step at a time. I need to get a grip. All this is all dealing with the aspect of, you know, touch or movement in some way. This is kind of the solid language that they will use, and you can get an idea of then, you know, whether they're gravitating towards more a kinesthetic learner. When we think about how they actually learn, the learning strategies and methodologies, this is really what we need to keep in mind, that we make sure that they're doing something. And it may be, you know, just holding a pen or a paintbrush, or it could be doing something on the computer. They're actually touching something to work out how they're learning. They might want to walk through the process. So they might want to actually role play something and get some activity. If they're, particularly that would be quite useful if they're in their language arts area. So they will be very keen to have someone else demonstrate it to them, and they will then also get involved. Experiments, so setting up an experiment. Anything that has them using their hands, at that last part, building models. So in art, it could be, using their hands to create something. It could be even in history, it's building, a cardboard structure of some historical artifact or whatever. So whatever allows them to get their hands in and get involved in the activity is extremely important for them. And they will also, because they have a sense of timing, they will kind of know what they need to do and how long they need to be involved in that. But they will also take their time, which corresponds to their speaking slowly. They're not going to be someone who's going to rush in and go, wham, bam, that's great, let's move on to the next thing, which you might find a visual learner will do. With the kinesthetic, they just want that engagement with hands-on. Then if we go to our Ys, who is our analytic type person, read-write is a terminology that I use here, because they will go through things logically. They will read manuals and texts, look at systems, analyse data. So that's the type of thing that they will do. If we think about the student in the classroom, they're not going to be the first one to put up their hand because of that introverted, needing to get it right, needing to be certain, and being that convergent thinker. So often in a classroom, you might see a teacher will select a student who hasn't got their hand up, and that may actually not be a smart move by the teacher, because that child may be this analytical learner and just needs some more time to process the information. So let's have a look at some of the distinctions to get an idea of what this is all about. If you're an analytic into the logic and processes as a teacher, you might use an opening sentence about, does that make sense? Because it's sense in the concept of in order, step by step, a process, a procedure. This is a logical thing that we might do. So the distinctions are, for them, they will need to figure things out. They'll need to work it out and have the time to do that. Because they're an introverted and want to have their kind of own space to work through things, they'll probably engage in a lot of self-talk. So they'll have the conversations in their heads all the time with themselves. I don't want to go to the extent of with imaginary other figures, but sometimes that might be the case, these kind of imaginary conversations, but that's what they'll do. They'll do this self-talk. They will think things through before taking an action, so they're not spontaneous people. They'll take their time on that. Logic, of course, is there. They'll use that to make their decisions. They'll work it through, that this, you'll do this, and then you'll do that, and then you'll do that, and then you can go and spend this money, or then you can go and undertake that task. They'll make sure that everything, they dot the I's, cross the T's. The other thing too is they'd like to know the detail. So if you are, say, a visual oriented teacher and you will just give them the big picture of what needs to happen and not actually give them something that gives them some step-by-steps or gives them some criteria like a rubric for how you're going to assess their work, then these kids will be a little bit at sea, because they need to know all of that detail right up front. They want all the information before they will be willing to be fully engaged. To a certain extent, it's a little bit like building trust. They want to trust that you have given them all the things that they need before they will undertake the particular task. For them, when it comes to memorising things, in particular for how they will cope with exams, is that they'll memorise the steps and the sequences, and that's how they will be able to bring back the information when they're sitting for something like an exam or in an environment where they have to recall things pretty quickly. The language that you might hear them using is well, an example there, I need to know all that I have to do, otherwise I don't know what I'm doing. They may ask the question about how long does this need to be. So they want to know that they've got to give a 3-minute presentation, or that it's going to be X number of words, or it has to be 3-minute video, or whatever it is that you want them to do. They want to know that. They might need more time because they want to get things right, and they would prefer that somebody else gets up first. So let's say you have got them doing some sort of report and they have a choice of what they need to do. They might prefer that another person, particularly you'll find an auditory person, will want to jump up and be the first one to do things. They'll hold back a little bit. And for them, it's because they're just wanting to be, they're being that introverted, I don't want to push myself out there just in case I am wrong. And that's that internal language that they're going through. What else we got there? I need to understand, I need more information, and I'd rather work alone, which is interesting whenever you're considering putting them into groups. And when you're putting them into groups, it's, if you can manage it, mix up the groups so that it's not all of the analytical kids who are analytical in one group. Try and mix them up. Now, that's going to take some time because all these kids will need to get used to each other. For instance, with the analytic person, they're going to probably find that the auditory learner in their group is just a little bit overbearing, a little bit too full on for them. And for the visual learner, they might find that the kinesthetic just takes too long. So that it's going to be, there's some interesting dynamics in a way that can happen when you pull these kids together in a mixed group. So it might be that you're initially getting them to work in groups of like, and then start to mix them up slowly, a little bit at a time. When it comes to the analytic learner, these are the sorts of things that they really like to get their head around, is the facts and figures, the projects, the handouts with detail, doing some additional reading over and above what is actually required, because they want to make sure that they grab as much information as they can, because they want to make sure that this is the right stuff to do. Quizzes, the closed questions rather than open one. They want to do, short answer or multiple choice rather than having to be expressive in an open-ended question. Structured lessons, teacher-directed instruction, anything that is sequential. So let's think about an inquiry learning environment. You may have a framework that you use which allows students to go through a sequential process for when they're working through researching their assignments. So there's all sorts of things that you can have here that can also be useful for other students, as long as for an auditory you explain it, for a visual you give them a little bit of flexibility for what they can do, and for your kinesthetic it engages them in some sort of hands-on activity. So let's go back here to looking at kind of reaffirming which one are you. Also, can you identify maybe a colleague on your staff, or even a family member? Because this isn't just about learning, this is how we show up in the world day in, day out. We can be a combination of these, but we'll be predominantly one. For example, I had an incident where I had a teacher librarian who was on one of my courses, said that she didn't think that she was an analytic person, because that's how her report showed up. And I said to her, oh, well, let's just have a conversation. And I said to her, tell me about the last holiday that you went on. And for her, when she told me about the holiday, it was all about the itinerary and what they did day one, and then they went to day two, and then this is what they did. And it was very much in that logical, sequential reporting back about what they did on their holiday. If she was auditory, she would have talked to me about the sounds that she would have heard, the busyness of the people, or the chattering of the people in the cafe, or the seagulls on the beach, or whatever. It would have been those auditory elements. If she was more predominantly a kinesthetic, it would have been about kind of the activities that they would have engaged in, or how she might have felt about say getting a massage, or the feel of the sand under her feet or something like that. And the visual would have been giving me lots of different pictures and visual images of what they would have seen. So after I had that conversation with her, she said, wow, you're right. I can see now that this is what I am predominantly, is I am this analytical, read-write, detailed, smart person in the way that I function. So having conversations with people can actually clarify for you whether the person is visual, auditory, kinesthetic or analytical. The other thing too is considering then, how do you teach? Where's your emphasis? In all honesty, you might be able to identify pretty quickly there, or do you do a combination? So when I was going through the actual learning strategies of each of those learning styles, and you were taking down some notes, you may now have a page in front of you where you actually have a mix of those, or you might have a imbalance and a little bit too much in one area. So think about the combinations that you could write into your programs. But then also too, you need to feel comfortable, as well as trying to look at how you can address the learners in your classroom. When we're looking at the modern kind of learning environment, this shouldn't be any surprise to you, the percentages that are given here, that if people are just lectured at within so many days, they will only recall like 5% of what they've been told. If they have, reading, it'll be 10%. So this is after something like 20 days, 30 days. This is the percentages that we've got. As you can see, our highest percentage is down the bottom here, which is teaching others. So if we think about how we can combine all the different type of strategies whereby they are reading in a way that they're seeing, they're hearing and they're seeing visuals, they're touching with demonstration, they're auditory and having conversations, practice by doing, well, that again is bringing in your kinesthetic. But this big element here, it's then how we get them to communicate back what they have learnt. And by getting them to be able to communicate back their learning in their preferred style, it means that they will reach other people and probably retain a lot more. So although we may have a preference, it's rare in this day and age to find someone who is totally one modality. But however, when we're planning programs, we need to try and take in account all of their preferences. So if we think about the concept of blended learning, this is kind of a definition of what it is. So it involves that combination of online and face-to-face, and they're used beside each other complementary to provide a comprehensive learning environment within an enriched online learning space. So our challenge here is, how do we bring in, and really if we bring in the visual, auditory, kinesthetic, because your analytic tends to run through all of them, but if we at least bring in 3, then we'll have a chance to provide an environment where the students can gravitate towards the way that they learn the best. So if we think about even this particular presentation, there's plenty of visuals, there's the auditory, and the kinesthetic is trying to encourage you to be involved, either through asking questions or taking notes or making some contribution. Now, if kids are getting bored, then we need to do a number of things. We need to build up the variety. We need to change the timing, so it might be not allowing them to be on doing a task for too long, and we need to mix up the interaction, whether it be individuals or groups. And if we do that, we are to a certain extent covering the visual, auditory, kinesthetic. So we're getting the task happening. We're getting the people involved, either individuals or groups, and we're getting the activity. So we have the three major ways of taking in and having learning experiences, and then the analytic can be embedded across all of those, because in all situations we are, when we're using the filters in our mind, we are actually analysing that anyway to be able to then store it and code it in our mind to then represent it in some way back when we're sending a message. If we think about all the different blended learning models, then one of these or a number of these may be something that you already use for your students. If we think of just the face-to-face, that's just purely face-to-face with the students in giving them instruction, and then you would supplement that with some online or computer work. If it's self-blended, then it's a case of there are learning activities for students to do, and they supplement the face-to-face class. So there's a range of different instructional methods there that or learning activities there. Then of course the online lab is probably not so prominent today. When computer labs first came out, that the students went into the computer lab and that's how they were taught. Or we may see the online lab evident in schools where they're regional schools and there's not enough students to make up a class. So what they'll do is they'll put them in an instructional lab environment with a teacher who may be in another location who's their online teacher, and they're supported by someone from the school. Now I had an example of this where a friend of mine who's in Tasmania, she was an online support supervisor for the students at her school. She didn't actually teach anything. She was just there as the on-site support person. Then we've got the personalised blend, where the teacher has designed some face-to-face, they've designed some online, and there's options for the students to be able to pick up. The flexible is that really most of the instruction is managed by the students, and the teacher just comes in with some intervention as it's needed. The rotation is pretty well all self-paced. So the information is out there and the students are pacing themselves, and there's minimal face-to-face instruction. And it might be that it's on a just-in-time learning space when the face-to-face instruction's there. Then the online is just purely online, and that can be managed through a learning management system. So there's probably a mix of what blended learning we've got, but at all of the times that we're engaging students, if your school is moving to a stronger e-learning influence or something that is managed by a learning management system, regardless of what you do, you need to be mindful of the different types of students and the way that they will learn. If it's a pure online environment, then there's going to be the need for visuals as well as auditory, as well as some very clear procedures of what they need to do, what's required of them, activities that they can engage in. So all of those are quite evident in what we're needing to cover. So just in going into a summary here, I've given the definition of NLP, the mind, the language and the programming, the behaviour, the representational systems of how we take in information, filter it, sort it and then represent it in some other format, the psychometric tools that I use, the various characteristics of each of the learning styles, then looking at more distinctions, the language that we hear people speak that gives an indication of their preference, the learning and teaching strategies, and then also the blended learning space where we are able to address all the styles in the way we set up our instructional environments. So if you want to, here's some more information about staying in touch. The website there, Twitter handles, Facebook pages, and then also to just being mindful that if you wish to continue the conversation around this idea of learning styles and NLP distinctions, then this is our community space where people who are only involved in the EduWebinar community come, and we share information, exchange information, have some input. Some of the presenters are in there so they can add more to the information that you might want. Also too, a couple of webinars coming up that will connect in with this particular topic, and these are dates here in March, and if you miss those dates, then the webinar archives will be where you'll be able to find this material after those particular days when they're broadcast. So I've got Kay Adoni doing questions and questioning, frameworks for inquiry learning. So our each learning style has a predominant way that they will ask questions. The combination of that helps to give that whole learning experience for a student in inquiry. And then this one here about connected books. So again, the type of reading and the way that students will interact in reading is again representational of the way that they will learn in their space. So there's some upcoming webinars, and then if you miss those dates, then eventually they will be in the webinar archive and you can find them there. So thank you very much for coming along to this particular broadcast, and I hope that you've been able to pick up some different techniques of how you can work out your particular learners, what learning preferences they have, and how you might be able to then harvest some of those teaching learning strategies and combine them together so that you have your kids engaged and learning at their best.